Part 1. The Law Beneath Sensitivity. There comes a moment in every empath's life when silence becomes heavier than words. It is not the silence of rest nor the silence of fear. It is the silence that arrives before transformation, a hum beneath existence, a vibration that cannot be heard, only felt, like the tremor that passes through the body of the earth before the rain begins to fall. Carl Jung once said that consciousness expands through suffering, but he never wrote what happens when that suffering begins to look back at you. He called it the inversion of sensitivity, the moment when empathy stops being a wound and becomes a mirror. Not a mirror of reflection, but of revelation. For years, Jung observed people who felt the world too deeply, people who could sense the sorrow of others before a single word was spoken. He noticed how their kindness aged them, how their love made them tired, how they could walk into a room and know instantly who was broken, and yet could never explain how. These were not fragile people. They were receivers, antennas of the collective unconscious. They felt everything, saw everything, and believed that this was love. But Jung began to realize something strange. What destroyed these souls was not their sensitivity itself, but their lack of boundaries around it. They were absorbing what was never meant to be carried. They mistook perception for responsibility. They mistook compassion for salvation. And slowly, their inner light dimmed under the weight of other people's storms. He wrote in his journal, "The empath's curse is not that they feel too much. It is that they feel without structure. And in this absence of structure, love becomes a form of drowning. Empathy becomes erosion. The self, once clear as a lake, becomes clouded by the reflections of everyone else. To live this way is to forget one's own sound, to become a chorus of borrowed feelings." Jung called this participation mystique, the ancient fusion between self and other, a psychic state older than civilization itself. The empath does not know where they end or where the world begins, and yet within this chaos lies the seed of awakening, because every soul that loses itself in others eventually hungers to return home, and when that hunger becomes unbearable, when the body can no longer contain the weight of collective emotion, something inside begins to fracture, not as destruction, but as the beginning of individuation. The fracture is sacred. It is the first crack in the shell of unconscious empathy. It is the whisper that says, "This pain is not yours to hold." When the empath finally begins to see this truth, their world does not end. It begins again. They start to discern between what belongs to them and what belongs to the field. They learn that love without boundaries is not divine. It is delusion. That compassion without consciousness is not healing. It is captivity. And in that recognition, the soul begins to rise through its own ruins. Jung called this the law beneath sensitivity, the principle that governs every empathic transformation. When awareness touches emotion, emotion becomes energy, and energy, once seen, becomes freedom. Freedom, however, is not peace at first. It is disorientation, the trembling that comes after a long sleep. But in that trembling, in that first breath of awareness, the empath begins to remember what they are. Not a vessel for pain, but a channel for light. They were never meant to absorb the suffering of others. They were meant to illuminate it, to bring it into consciousness where it can finally dissolve. And as this realization dawns, something ancient within them stirs. It is the self-awakening, and slow, luminous, unstoppable. Part 2. The Fracture. Every awakening begins with something that feels like loss. Not a physical death, but the quiet collapse of everything you believed you had to be. The empath reaches a point where their compassion begins to crack under its own weight. And through that fracture, light enters. Jung called this the psychic saturation point. The moment when the soul can no longer carry what was never its own. He described it as an inner shattering, not into pieces but into awareness. The vessel does not break because it is weak. It breaks because it has outgrown its original shape. This is when life intervenes with precision. The betrayal arrives, the abandonment, the realization that those they protected were never protecting them. It is not the act that destroys. It is the recognition that they saw the signs all along and refused to believe themselves. The fracture comes when self-trust is reborn through pain. When the empath says for the first time, "I knew, and I chose not to know." That sentence alone marks the end of blindness and the beginning of sovereignty. In Jung's notes, he wrote, "When consciousness grows stronger than sentiment, the soul stops apologizing for clarity. That is the essence of the fracture. The eyes that once softened to avoid conflict now see without hesitation. The heart that once absorbed everything now listens selectively. Compassion remains, but it no longer bows. For the world, this change is unsettling. The empath becomes unrecognizable, calm where they once panicked, detached where they once clung. People who thrived on their kindness begin to sense that something sacred has shifted. The supply has ended. The mirror has cleared. The energy that once poured outward now turns inward, forming a quiet center of gravity. This stage can feel like exile. The empath might think they have lost their humanity. But in truth, they are rediscovering it, not as servitude but as self-respect. They are learning that empathy without discernment is not virtue, but vulnerability, that boundaries are not rejection, but refinement. That saying no is sometimes the purest expression of love, and so the fracture deepens, not to destroy but to realign. Every relationship begins to rearrange itself according to truth. Every mask begins to fall away. People who depended on their silence begin to fear their voice. The empath, once defined by softness, now radiates quiet authority, not through dominance but through presence, Jung wrote. The one who has integrated their feeling function holds the power to perceive without being possessed. That perception, once a curse, now becomes their compass. They no longer drown in emotion, they navigate it. They no longer react, they respond. They no longer absorb chaos, they observe it until it loses form. And here lies the paradox of the fracture. It feels like losing everything, yet it is the birth of inner freedom. Because what breaks is not the soul, it is the contract with illusion. When the empath stops confusing love with sacrifice, the self that had been waiting beneath the pain finally steps forward. It speaks with a new voice, calm, unwavering, ancient. The voice says, "You do not need to become smaller to love. You only need to become clearer." And from that clarity, a new kind of empathy is born, one that sees, one that chooses, one that liberates. Part 3. The Metamorphosis of Empathy. When the fracture settles, a strange calm follows. It is not peace yet, but the silence after the storm. The stillness that asks, "Who am I when I am not carrying the world?" This is where transformation begins, not with effort, but with the gradual recognition that the old self can no longer return. Jung called this stage metamorphosis. the transmutation of empathy from reaction into awareness. It is a slow reconfiguration of perception itself. The empath begins to understand that emotion, when seen through the lens of consciousness, becomes information. Every feeling holds a message. Every pain carries an intelligence. They begin to notice patterns, not just in others but in themselves. How they once attracted those who needed saving. How their generosity became currency in the economy of manipulation. How their silence once held the secrets of others while neglecting the truth of their own. And yet, instead of resentment, something else emerges. Fascination. The empath starts to observe rather than absorb. They see how emotion flows, how energy transfers, how every relationship is an exchange of frequencies rather than words. They become students of the unseen. Where others see chaos, they see choreography. Jung believed that this was the moment when the feeling function becomes conscious. He wrote, "The individual who can perceive emotion without drowning in it begins to touch the roots of wisdom." This is where empathy becomes an art form, not a burden, but a compass. The empath starts to move differently through the world. They listen, but they do not lose themselves. They feel, but they no longer identify with what they feel. They stand inside emotion the way one stands inside a fire, aware of its heat but unburned. It is as if awareness itself has become flame-proof. This metamorphosis is not gentle. The body resists. The mind tries to recreate old dramas for comfort. The ego clings to the familiar pattern of rescuing, of being needed. But something deeper, older than the ego, begins to intervene. It whispers, "You are not here to fix. You are here to see." And as this whisper grows louder, the empath discovers something extraordinary. Their capacity to perceive is their capacity to create. Every observation begins to alter the field around them. They realize that perception is participation, that by witnessing clearly they reshape reality. Jung described this as the alchemical phase of the psyche. Just as ancient alchemists turned lead into gold through fire and patience, the empath transforms emotion into awareness through presence and surrender. The fire is pain. The patience is consciousness, and the gold is clarity. They begin to understand that empathy was never about suffering with others but about perceiving the architecture of human experience. That every wound, personal or collective, is a doorway into understanding. They realize that to feel deeply is not to drown. It is to dive into the collective ocean and return with pearls of truth. In dreams, Jung said, this stage often appears as light emerging from underground water, emotion illuminated by consciousness. It is the psyche announcing, "The alchemy has begun." The empath becomes luminous not by avoiding pain but by refining it. Every heartbreak becomes a distillation of wisdom. Every disappointment becomes a purification of motive. And with each purification, empathy becomes less emotional, more energetic, less personal, more universal. This is what Jung called psychological sovereignty. The soul no longer identifies with emotion but directs it. The empath becomes both the vessel and the fire, both the witness and the transformation itself. And as this metamorphosis continues, a strange power awakens. A quiet, magnetic presence that needs no explanation. They no longer speak to be understood. They speak to align. They no longer help to be needed. They help to remind, and those who listen begin to feel it too. The vibration of truth disguised as calm. Part 4. The Mirror Effect. When the metamorphosis completes its first cycle, the empath no longer lives as a sponge, They live as a mirror. Their energy ceases to absorb and begins to reflect. The emotions of others no longer enter them. They pass through like wind through an open temple. The empath no longer holds what is not theirs. They illuminate it. Jung called this the reflective field, the moment when consciousness becomes so steady that it alters the space around it. He wrote, "The self that is aware of its boundaries begins to shape reality instead of being shaped by it. The mirror effect is not learned, it is awakened. It happens naturally once the empath stops running from stillness, because stillness itself is power. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the point around which all motion turns." At first, people around the awakened empath cannot explain what has changed. They only feel it. The manipulator grows uneasy. The anxious grow calm. The dishonest stumble over their own words. It is not magic, it is coherence. Awareness radiates like heat, and anything incoherent cannot survive in its proximity. Jung wrote, "The conscious individual becomes an axis of the collective psyche. Their equilibrium forces chaos into order. The empath who is integrated no longer reacts to projection. They reveal it. They no longer carry other people's pain. They expose its architecture. They become what Jung called a moral center of gravity, a stabilizing presence in a disordered field. To others, this presence feels divine. But to the empath it feels natural. They have simply stopped pretending. They no longer trade authenticity for approval. They no longer bend to comfort others' shadows. They understand that love without truth is manipulation, and truth without love is violence. They have learned the alchemy that blends both. People who live through masks will find the awakened empath unbearable. They will sense that their illusions dissolve in that quiet gaze. They will call it arrogance, coldness, distance. But it is none of those things. It is clarity, the most radical form of compassion. The mirror effect teaches the empath a difficult lesson, that healing others was never their job. Their presence is medicine enough. Every word, every gesture, every silence begins to rearrange energy fields invisibly. They become conduits of the unconscious becoming conscious. When someone lies to them now, they feel the distortion before the words finish forming. When someone hides pain, they sense the weight of it before a tear falls. This awareness no longer drains them, it informs them. It tells them where to stay, when to leave, what to nurture, and what to release. They live by inner alignment, not external approval. And something extraordinary begins to happen. The world starts to reorganize itself around them. Relationships based on illusion dissolve quietly. Paths open effortlessly. Opportunities arise as reflections of their new vibration. The external reality becomes a mirror of their internal order. Jung described this phenomenon as synchronicity following individuation. He wrote, "Once the psyche becomes whole, the world arranges itself to echo that wholeness. That is the true mirror effect, the universe itself reflecting the integrated soul. To live in this state is not to be perfect, but to be transparent, to feel the world's pain without mistaking it for your own, to hold both love and truth in the same breath and understand that they are not opposites, but partners." In this awareness, the empath becomes invisible in the way light is invisible, everywhere, yet unseen, shaping reality by its very presence. They no longer crave recognition. They crave resonance. They no longer wish to be understood. They wish to be clear. Jung wrote, "When a person becomes transparent to themselves, they become transparent to the world." The empath has reached that transparency. Their existence no longer resists life, it reflects it. And that reflection changes everything. Part 5. The Return. Every awakening must descend. The empath who has touched stillness cannot remain in the mountain forever. The path must curve back toward the valley, toward people, noise, imperfection. Jung called this the conscious descent, the phase where awareness learns to live among shadows without becoming them again. At first, re-entry feels disorienting. The empath steps back into the same world, yet nothing feels the same. The laughter of others sounds different, lighter, almost distant. The chaos that once consumed them now moves in slow motion, like a storm watched from within a glass dome. They are in the world but not of it. Jung wrote, "The task of the awakened soul is not to escape the collective, but to walk within it as light disguised as ordinary." And so the empath learns the art of gentle participation. They speak when needed, remain silent when truth requires space. They move slower, more deliberately, as though each gesture carries consequence. People sense their difference before understanding it. Some feel drawn to them like seeds seeking sunlight. Others feel discomfort, as if their presence disturbs the machinery of pretense. The awakened empath does not chase either. They allow. They know that resonance reveals all things in time. This stage teaches them that peace is not withdrawal, it is mastery. They no longer hide from life's noise. They walk through it with grace. When confronted with projection, they respond with stillness. When offered manipulation, they return clarity. They have learned the sacred language of neutrality, the state Jung described as radiant balance. They no longer seek to prove their worth. They no longer perform empathy to be accepted. They understand now that kindness without consciousness is self-erasure, and so they love differently. Not from emptiness, but from overflow. Not from fear of losing, but from the joy of giving without depletion. The return is not a regression. It is a demonstration. They embody what they once preached. Their life itself becomes philosophy made flesh. They no longer talk about awakening. They are the awakening. Their presence becomes the sermon, their calm the teaching, their eyes the reminder. Jung noted that when a person integrates fully, even their smallest actions carry archetypal resonance. The way they listen, the way they breathe, the way they walk through a crowd, all of it becomes symbolic, a living ritual of balance. He called this living from the self. And those who live from the self move the collective unconsciously, as the moon moves the tides. The empath who has returned no longer measures their value by how much they heal others. They know that by existing coherently, they already contribute to healing. They no longer try to fix, they reveal. They no longer try to save, they embody. They no longer look for purpose, they live it effortlessly. Relationships change again. Some dissolve quietly like mist in sunlight. Others deepen into sacred companionships free of demand or dependency. They learn to love from center, not circumference. They know that real love expands freedom, not contracts it. The awakened empath becomes both participant and witness, fully human, yet profoundly aware. Jung called this paradox the union of the opposites. The divine and the mundane finally coexist within one heartbeat, and in that rhythm the empath learns the ultimate lesson, that to serve humanity is not to carry its wounds, but to walk beside it, awake. They become translators of silence. When others despair, they remind through presence that everything still holds meaning. When others rage, they listen without absorbing the fire. They are the still point in a spinning world, a living symbol of integration, the human made whole. Jung wrote, The self does not seek recognition. It radiates inevitability. The empath who has returned radiates exactly that, inevitability. Their peace cannot be taken, for it is no longer dependent on circumstance. They have become what Jung once called the stable soul in an unstable world. And as they move through life, quietly, compassionately, invisibly powerful, they begin to understand why everything had to happen the way it did. The pain, the betrayal, the collapse, all were initiations. Each moment of breaking was the sound of the shell cracking so that light could enter. The return, then, is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of conscious living, the art of embodying spirit while remaining fully human. Part 6. The Alchemy of Awareness. There comes a moment when awareness itself begins to shimmer, when the empath realizes that they are no longer healing, no longer searching, no longer fighting to understand. They are simply seeing. This is the alchemy Jung called the illumination of the unconscious. It is not mystical in the way people imagine. It is scientific at the level of the soul. It is the exact moment when emotion stops being storm and becomes structure, when what once hurt now teaches, when what once drowned now carries. In Jung's private journals, he described this as the transmutation of energy through consciousness. He wrote, "The act of perceiving transforms. What is seen ceases to possess." The empath now lives this truth. They no longer fear what they feel because they finally understand the hidden order beneath emotion. Sadness, once unbearable, now reveals itself as depth. Anger becomes boundary. Fear becomes precision. Loneliness becomes prayer. Every emotion is recognized as an element in the great chemistry of the psyche. This is not detachment. It is divine participation. The empath learns that by naming an emotion, they release it. By feeling consciously, they redeem it. The unconscious becomes language, and language becomes liberation. They remember what the mystics and psychologists alike tried to describe in different tongues, that awareness is not an observer of life, but life becoming aware of itself. The empath begins to feel this directly, the pulse of consciousness in every vibration of pain, the intelligence hidden inside confusion, the wisdom disguised as weakness. Their life becomes an ongoing alchemical experiment. Each day begins in silence, the sacred container. Each encounter is an element to be transmuted. Each reaction is fire, and the result of every transmutation is more clarity, more calm, more truth. They realize that awakening was never about escaping emotion. It was about sanctifying it. To turn the chaos of feeling into the geometry of meaning, to transform experience into symbol, to turn the personal into the archetypal. Jung once said, "The self speaks in symbols, for symbols are the only language broad enough to contain truth." The empath now understands this language instinctively. Dreams, synchronicities, body sensations, all are part of one vast conversation. Every tear carries code. Every silence holds scripture. The psyche has become a temple, and the rituals are awareness itself. This realization changes how they move through the world. The empath no longer seeks healing. They seek harmony. They no longer chase meaning. They become it. Even in pain, they feel grace moving beneath the surface. Even in conflict, they sense evolution unfolding in disguise. Others might look at them and say, "You've become cold." But it is not coldness, and it is clarity. It is the absence of emotional distortion. It is the light of the mind and heart finally moving as one. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the union of opposites. The empath has become both fire and water, fierce yet fluid, luminous yet grounded. They embody paradox without confusion. They feel everything yet remain untouched. They know that suffering, when met with awareness, ceases to be suffering. It becomes transformation. The alchemy of awareness is irreversible. Once consciousness has tasted itself, it cannot forget. The empath has crossed a threshold where they are no longer human in the ordinary sense. They are human plus presence, body plus awareness, emotion plus meaning. And from this union, everything begins to align. Work becomes calling. Love becomes meditation. Silence becomes communion. Every ordinary act becomes a ritual of the sacred. They no longer try to manifest. They resonate. They no longer chase. They attract through coherence. They no longer ask why, they listen, until the answer becomes unnecessary. Jung described this state as living from the symbolic center. It is the condition where consciousness stabilizes as self-awareness, the philosopher's stone hidden inside the human heart. The empath has found it, not through escape, but through endurance, through feeling, through seeing. And when they finally look back at the long road behind them, they understand that every heartbreak, every silence, every fall was the fire required to refine the gold. They whisper, not in pride but in awe, it was never punishment. It was initiation. Part 7. The Silence After Transformation. When the alchemy completes, there is no explosion of light, no final revelation. There is only silence, not the silence of absence but of arrival, the stillness that follows when the mind no longer argues with life. Jung called this the return to the self. It is not a destination but a recognition that the one who was searching was never separate from what was sought. The empath sits now in that recognition. There is nothing left to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to become, only being. For the first time, emotion moves through them like wind through open doors. Grief visits and they let it pass. Joy visits, they let it pass. They no longer cling to light nor resist shadow. They are the awareness that contains both. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness so vast that words cannot touch it. It hums with meaning. Every breath feels ancient. Every heartbeat echoes the rhythm of something eternal. In this silence, they begin to understand love anew, not as attachment nor as sacrifice, but as recognition. Love becomes the mirror through which consciousness sees itself, infinite, unbreakable, unafraid. They see the divine not as something above, but as the pulse beneath all things. The ordinary becomes holy again. They look around and realize that nothing external has changed, yet everything has transformed. The same faces, the same streets, the same sky, but now each detail vibrates with aliveness. Every sound carries harmony. Every shadow holds light within it. The world has not become perfect. It has become transparent. Jung wrote, "The goal of individuation is not perfection but wholeness. Wholeness is not spotless. It is spacious. It allows contradiction without confusion. It allows imperfection without judgment. It allows life to be exactly as it is because it finally understands that all of it belongs." The empath, once exhausted by feeling, now feels infinitely without fatigue. They have become the river itself, not the rock resisting it. They no longer swim, they flow. They no longer defend peace. They are peace. This silence is powerful. It carries authority that needs no assertion. When they speak, words come slowly, weighted with presence. When they act, their gestures ripple far beyond what they can see. People sense something in them, not charisma but gravity. The quiet pull of someone who no longer needs to explain their existence. Jung said, One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The empath has done exactly that. They have walked through the underworld of feeling and returned luminous. Now even their silence teaches. It radiates the unspoken message: you are not broken. You are becoming. This is the silence that holds all paradoxes. Strength and gentleness, solitude and connection, grief and joy, all coexisting like constellations within the same sky. The empath finally understands that the goal was never to escape the world's pain, but to become so conscious that even pain transforms into meaning. And in this final stillness they feel something vast opening inside, a sense that the journey never truly ends, that awakening is not an event but a rhythm, expanding forever. They understand that every soul is walking the same spiral of remembering, that all suffering is the friction that polishes consciousness into awareness, that every empath, every seeker, every heart that breaks, is the universe finding its reflection again. So they rest, not in escape, but in participation. They watch life unfold with reverence, knowing that everything, the light, the loss, the love, is sacred. The silence after transformation is not the end. It is the sound of the soul breathing freely at last. Part 8. Epilogue. The Hidden Law. In the end, Jung said that life itself is the psyche made visible. Every encounter, every heartbreak, every silence, all of it is the unconscious speaking in the language of experience. The empath, more than anyone, learns to hear that language. They become fluent in what cannot be said. This is the hidden law, that awareness and emotion are not enemies, but dance partners in the eternal rhythm of becoming. That suffering was never punishment, it was initiation. That empathy was never weakness, it was the soul's memory of unity. When the empath finally sees, they realize that their pain was never personal. It was the human condition passing through them, asking to be understood. They were the bridge, between shadow and light, between form and formlessness, between the personal story and the archetype behind it. This is why Jung called certain souls carriers of the collective. They feel more because they are built to translate. They suffer more because they are designed to perceive the architecture of the unseen. And when they awaken, their seeing becomes medicine for others. They realize now that what once broke them was the same force that was shaping them. Every betrayal refined discernment. Every silence deepened listening. Every loss expanded the heart's capacity to hold truth. There was never cruelty in the process, only precision. The hidden law whispers through the veins of all existence. Whatever is made conscious transforms. It is that simple, that sacred. The empath's life is proof of it. They have turned the lead of emotion into the gold of awareness. They have proven that sensitivity is not fragility. It is evolution. Now when they look upon the world, they no longer see chaos. They see symbols moving toward integration. They see humanity's confusion as a dream that is still unfolding. They see every argument, every act of cruelty, every moment of beauty as fragments of the same soul learning to know itself. They walk among the asleep with tenderness, not superiority. They know how long it takes to awaken. They know how painful it is to feel without guidance, so they offer presence, not preaching, silence, not noise, and their silence heals. Jung believed that those who reach this level of awareness serve the collective unconsciously. He wrote, "The individual who becomes whole redeems the world, for wholeness radiates through all connections." The empath who has seen becomes that radiance. They no longer belong to themselves. They belong to consciousness itself. But even in their illumination, humility remains. They do not call themselves awakened. They do not seek followers or titles. They understand that enlightenment is not a crown. It is a responsibility. The more they see, the more gently they walk. Sometimes they still cry, not from despair, but from awe. Because to feel the world so deeply and yet love it still, that is the highest form of courage. That is the mark of an evolved heart. In dreams, this final stage often appears as a light expanding beyond the body, not escaping the world, but infusing it. The self no longer stands apart from life. It becomes life. The observer dissolves into the observed. There is no separation left, only the awareness that has always been watching through every pair of eyes. This is the true meaning of Jung's hidden law, that consciousness is not achieved, it is remembered. It was there all along, waiting behind every emotion, behind every silence, behind every heartbreak. And when the empath finally sees, truly sees, they realize that the journey was never about becoming something more, but about unbecoming everything that was never real. They smile softly as the night hums around them. The same silence that once frightened them now feels like home. The same darkness that once consumed them now glows with quiet gold. Because they understand. There is no light without shadow, no awakening without sleep, no empathy without humanity. The circle has closed. And in that closure everything breathes again. For the empath who has walked through all thresholds, there is only one task left: to live quietly, courageously, consciously. To be the proof that sensitivity is the universe remembering itself. They whisper into the dark, I am not what I feel. I am what sees.